Matthew. I wonder how you envisage Matthew in your mind. As we know, as you should know, the Gospels bear names which were given to them by tradition. That is to say, no Gospel has, I, Joe Bloggs, am writing this Gospel, the story of the life of Jesus. None of them actually state that. But in the evolving tradition of the church in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, names of authors were attributed to the Gospels. And a curious thing, one paper I did years and years ago was, I came to the conclusion that the further we get away from the Gospels, the more we know about their writers. In other words, within the traditions of the church, stories are attached to the authors of the Gospel. Now, Matthew is a little bit different because there is a story in this Gospel, the first in order in the New Testament, that tells of a tax collector by the name of Matthew, who left tax collecting and responded to the call of Jesus and followed him. Interestingly, that story is also told in Mark's Gospel, which presumably was a source for Matthew. And in that Gospel, the tax collector is called Levi, but in Matthew's Gospel, he's called Matthew. And so in the tradition, that becomes the hook on which the claim is made that Matthew, the tax collector, wrote this Gospel. Neither Elizabeth nor I will follow that line of traditional interpretation. And so as a counterpoint to that, we've put an image which comes from a really interesting collection that's of photographs that have been made over the last decade or so by a Black American photographer, James C. Lewis. And he has done portrayals of various biblical characters using Black characters, because, of course, we may be used in stained glass windows and Sunday school books to see white figures, but in fact, the Arabic Semitic heritage of early Christians means that they're more Black, really. So as a counterpoint, there's a different portrayal of Matthew. In your material, resource material, there's some discussion about Matthew, the author of the book, and some of the distinctive characteristics of the book. And as you will see from that discussion and from what we're doing in this study, Elizabeth and I are taking the line that the author Matthew was very strongly a Jew. He was immersed in the traditions of Torah, the traditions of the law. He knew the Psalms, he knew the prophets, he knew his scriptures, and he is portraying Jesus, sharpening the portrayal of Jesus that's there in Mark to ensure that we understand that this Jesus was a Jewish person. So that's a little bit about the author, and you can keep thinking about that figure throughout the course of this study. And for those of you who've done studies on the Gospels generally with us before, or have read material about it, you might well recognize this basic, simple pattern for Matthew's Gospel. There is an introduction and a conclusion. The introduction is the distinctive story about the birth of Jesus that Matthew tells, which has the flight into Egypt, the massacre by Herod, etc. And the conclusion, which is standard in all 4 Gospels, the Passion and Resurrection, although Matthew, of course, like Luke and John, does his own tweaking of the story that's basically there in Mark. But in between that, there's a sequence of narrative discourse. The narrative sections on the left-hand side of the screen largely follow the structure of Mark's Gospel. So Matthew appears to have Mark, and many of the stories in those narrative sections are almost word for word the same as in Mark's Gospel. Certainly the basic outline of the story, if you just take those narrative sections, is very familiar from Mark's Gospel. But into that Mark narrative, Matthew splices a series of discourses, 5 discourses, and it's regularly thought that he's choosing 5 because of the 5 books of Torah, the first 5 books of the law, the 5 books of Moses. So Matthew presents Jesus in the infancy narrative in the model of Moses. Those of you who've done our Advent series studies will recognize that. And Moses, of course, through his 5 books, Jesus replicates that through his 5 discourses. So throughout the course of this study, we'll be looking at each of those discourses in turn, starting today with the Sermon on the Mount, and we'll be also venturing into the narrative sections where we will see how Matthew maintains but modifies, develops, extends what he's received from Mark. So that's the basic structure of Matthew, widely accepted amongst scholars, and that's the structure we're using for this study. Okay, so we're going to look now at the Sermon on the Mount, so called in Matthew's Gospel, from the introductory verse. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Anybody know what the significance of the going up the mountain and the sitting down to speak and teach might be?
Would it relate to Moses going up the mountain?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Moses goes up the mountain to receive the law and then comes down to give it to the people. And then as Jewish tradition develops, the traditional teaching stance of the rabbi is to sit with the disciples gathered around the feet of the rabbi. So we have that introduction. We then have the famous Beatitudes, 8 Beatitudes collected by Matthew, and we'll look at them in a bit more detail a little bit later. And then there are a series of miscellaneous type sayings scattered throughout this sermon. That's one of the interesting features of it. We can see that there are clear collections within the sermon, like 5:17 to 48 is all about law. And in fact, Matthew has Jesus explain the law by saying, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," the so-called 6 antitheses. There's also a section in chapter 6 on righteousness, on what we're calling righteous justice. That's a translation of one Greek word, which can be translated as righteousness, can be translated as justice. So we're going to look at that next week, I think, righteous justice. The 3 traditional forms of Jewish piety: alms, prayer, and fasting. There's a section later in chapter 6, do not worry, consider the lilies of the field, etc. And then spliced throughout, as I've said, there are miscellaneous sayings in chapter 5, in chapter 6, and again in chapter 7. And these sayings kind of relate to one another, but aren't clearly and tightly interrelated. So that's another feature of the sermon. The sermon ends with the famous story, which those of you who went to Sunday school probably sang about: the wise man built his house upon the rock, etc. So it's about building on the rock or building on the sand, hearing what is said and doing what is taught. And then there's the conclusion. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. When Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. Which leads us to our first question: who was Jesus teaching in this sermon? The opening verses say, when he saw the crowds, he went up the mountain and sat down, and his disciples came to him. The implication is he's left the crowds behind. At the end, when Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds, who presumably had climbed the mountain by this stage and were there, were astonished at his teaching. And then when he goes down from there, the crowds follow him. So Elizabeth's going to put you into groups for an opening foray. You might like to, first of all, introduce yourselves to each other. We have new people to this study who haven't experienced the Rain Squires style of plunging you straight into the material. So make sure everyone's comfortable and welcome, and then explore this question a bit. Who do you think Jesus was teaching in this sermon, from what the beginning and the end verses say? Okay.
Okay, how long, John, do you want to give people?
Oh, let's say 6 minutes.
Okay. All right, people, I'm opening rooms.
Daniel is Kathy.
Oh, she's Kathy, right.
Yeah.
I'll change her name. And when we come back, I've got 2 big breakout rooms. There's 7 in each, and in each one there's a couple. Or, 2 people,
Yeah.
not necessarily a couple.
Yeah.
I should have combed my hair.
Uh,
I need to bring a comb down here for when I'm on Zoom. And I've kept Ian and Piers apart.
yeah.
They both can, get a bit
Yeah,
excitable. Pause recording.
We spent a lot of time actually introducing ourselves, so we didn't have much time to discuss this topic at all.
Okay.
Oh dear, I'm very sorry about that, Piers.
Well, we made a quick observation in the group anyway,
Yeah,
and that is that a crowd doesn't necessarily mean, like at the football last night, thousands and thousands of people. It could have been a smallish group made up of the disciples and their families and a few people who might have seen something happening and stopped by to listen. But we couldn't imagine crowds, thousands of people like the movies say.
I think we made
well,
the
that's right. It's probably anything over 40 would probably be considered a crowd.
One of the other points was that this may not necessarily be a singular event, but
Yeah.
a compilation of various gatherings and teachings that Matthew has consolidated into one event to sort of put all this writing together, all this wisdom together.
Yes, that's quite possible that he's collected a group of sayings, and we're going to be looking at that and collated them and put them all into this one speech.
And the other thing that with
If
the
the
comment that
crowd
was,
was only, say, 40 people, surely Matthew is writing for posterity, which includes us in this present day and age.
Possibly. He's certainly writing for his community at the time, which is, of course, written quite a few decades after the events he is describing. Margaret, you were saying something?
just that it was suggested that a bit like a compilation, but something that didn't have to happen immediately. It may have taken place over a number of days, like a discussion or something going on.
Yes. Any other comments?
Well, I think that one of the points I think that Kathy was making, and sort of Ian as well, that he's talking.
I've got a question, it's sort of off the topic. Why is it called Matthew? Why was it Matthew that it was attributed to? If Matthew didn't write it, why did they pick on Matthew?
Yeah.
Why didn't they pick on Jude or Bartholomew or somebody or other else?
There's always reasons behind these things. Matthew is considered, he's in the gospel for a start. So Jesus calls him Matthew, so we know he's there. And I think it was fairly well received that Peter and John and Andrew weren't writing down anything, at least in the Synoptic Gospels. The second thing is it was considered that a tax collector would be literate. So that's why out of the named people in the Gospel of Matthew that were close to Jesus, we have a tax collector. Tax collectors were literate. Therefore, why wouldn't Matthew write this gospel? So that's how the tradition works, Ian. You find a name and you think, how can we match it up? Oh, yes, this one will be literate, or this one will be a doctor, so he's literate too. And this one will be something else. He's a scribe, so he's literate. So we'll ascribe it to that named person within the gospel. So that's how these things come about. But we don't know who wrote any of them.
Can I say something, please?
Oh,
Sometimes I look at names and their meanings, and sometimes it's like, for example, I know the name Simon means listen. So if I had something around Simon, I would be, what am I listening to? If
Simon
that makes
means
sense.
rock.
No,
Simon
no.
means rock.
Peter
Peter
means
means rock.
rock.
Rock. Oh, yes.
Simon
Simon.
from
Sorry.
Shimshima,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean that's just the way I interpret the world, you know, like for me to pay attention to particular things of what I'm looking at.
Can I just ask, are you Sharon?
Yes, I am, and
Oh,
I
good.
did get
Okay.
in. Thank you.
Hi,
I
Sharon. Welcome.
missed
Glad
the
that you
first
got on.
bit. Yeah, thank you.
And we
Um,
should say welcome to everyone who's new. We didn't do that before. I've just changed your name, Sharon. And if you can move your camera slightly so we can see more than a full representation of you, that'd be great. So, thank you. For those of you, you probably all know us, but I'm Elizabeth. I'm the minister at Tuggeranong. I'm married to John, who's now retired. He was one of the Presbytery ministers in Canberra region.
just a bum layabout.
That's it. He just hangs around the house. Pet man.
Always do a little book.
So we like doing Bible studies. We're both biblical scholars, and we've been running these now for quite a few years. So if you are new, welcome, and that's who we are. And we're very pleased to have you with us. And Matt has already introduced his friends. So we have Sharon, we have Jean from North Ryde. Welcome, Sharon. Jean, you are the minister at North Ryde, so that's nice to have you with us. Most of these other people here are veterans of our studies, and at least half of them are part of the Tuggeranong congregation. So.
All righty. So let's move on to think a little bit more, picking up an idea that Bill, I think, has already mentioned. I like to think of this sermon not so much as a sermon, which presumably sermons should be tightly constructed and have a logic about them. There's a kind of fluidity and it's more a collection rather than a sermon. You will find in your notes, because there's a couple of people that are probably not on my list. At any rate, in the notes, I think on page 4, you will see an expanded version of this chart. It's well known that many of the sayings in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew appear also in the Sermon on the Plain in Luke's Gospel. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus is on a level place and a big crowd comes to him, and he teaches them by using beatitudes and by using sayings about loving one another and do not retaliate and do not judge, and the golden rule. All of those are in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. They're also in Luke's Sermon on the Plain. What is perhaps less well known, and the chart on page 4 just gives you an idea of the spread of things, is that various of the sayings of Jesus that Matthew includes in the Sermon on the Mount are also found at points in Mark's Gospel. Now, I'm not saying that they are all word for word. They're not. Some are fairly close. Some are just general ideas. But so some of these sayings were known to Mark, but Matthew and Luke picked them up and put them into their sermons. But also we have from the 2nd century, we have the book of the Gospel of Thomas, which is a strange beastie, and I've given some explanation about the Gospel of Thomas on page 5. But the Gospel of Thomas is a string of sayings of Jesus. They're just identified by their number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And if you look through the chart, you can see some of these sayings that are in the Sermon on the Mount, and indeed the Sermon on the Plain, are also reported as sayings of Jesus in Thomas's Gospel, although Thomas has a very Gnostic take on things, and so the wording is really kind of developed differently. Then there is also in our New Testament the letter of James, and there is a school of thought that this book was actually written by the brother of Jesus. And one of the things that influences that conclusion about the book of James is that there are many parts of that short letter that actually reflect the sayings of Jesus, that it's someone who knew Jesus' sayings very well, but the book doesn't say, and as Jesus said, blah, but rather it includes the content of those sayings of Jesus into the instructions that James is giving to his audience. So that's 5 different places where many of the sayings of Jesus that are recorded in Matthew's Gospel, or 4 other different places where they appear in different forms, different wording, different context, shaped differently, all of which leads to the idea that what Matthew is doing in the sermon is collecting sayings of Jesus that were remembered individually, but he is collating them into this one first large discourse. So you might have time in your groups now to launch into the substance of matters by responding to that question. And remember, if you haven't got the material that I've sent out, if you can send me your email, I will send it to you now.
Okay. How did you get on?
I think it's fair to say, Elizabeth, that none of us were greatly challenged by the question.
All right.
Okay.
We accept that that's what writers do, be they newspaper reporters, writers of novels or of plays or of any other sort of writing. You need a source. You pick up the bits and pieces from the source that please you. And if you don't have enough, you go and you find another source. You go to Wikipedia or Google or whatever else.
Yeah. Yes, it's very common to collect sources and sayings. And especially if you weren't an eyewitness, you're going to want all the sources that you can find to make sure that you're covering the right territory. Any other comments?
Well, I think Kathy had quite a very good analysis in terms of equating it with Kathy, you could talk about that, about the, with Moses, the law.
Yeah. I was just pointing out, I think that they are independent sayings of Jesus, but Matthew has given his own take on it, and he has, especially perhaps for his own Jewish community that were believing in Jesus as the Messiah, he has particularly emphasised the law, and that is the key verse in that is in the beginning of chapter 5, about how, not one iota of the law is to be changed.
Yes, Matthew is a community under law. And we know that not only from the Sermon on the Mount, but at the beginning of chapter 23, he instructs everyone to do what the Pharisees teach them because they sit on the seat of Moses. But then he says, don't do what they do because they actually don't follow their own teachings. So that's the knockdown argument, that it is a community that is following the law. Margaret?
Oh, well, my comment also was along similar lines of Kathy's, that I see this as, yes, they're independent sayings, and they've been put together by Matthew in the shape of like teachings as of Moses taught the original community. So the new Moses is teaching from the so-called mountain. And these are the sayings that he's put together to bring the new teaching. So independent, but deliberately brought together as a literary construct to fit his image of Jesus as the new Messiah.
Yes.
A new Moses.
The new Moses, that's right. And Jesus is frequently up a mountain in the Gospel of Matthew. The mountain is never named. It's just Jesus is up the mountain or he's up a mountain. But it is meant to conjure images of Moses in the Pentateuch. Any other comments?
Elizabeth, is there any reason to believe from any of the sources available to us that Jesus knew that his utterances would be recorded and perpetuated? Would he have had any idea at all that his followers were going to record what he had said?
Probably not, simply because this was an oral culture. And in an oral culture, the oral word is trusted more than the written word. So some people might have been taking notes possibly, but it's not very likely. It's much more likely the sayings were remembered and then recorded when people realised that the followers of Jesus were dying out and the stories may die out. So they started to be written down when that became more normalised to write things down. But initially it would have been stories and parables and sayings because it was an oral culture. So he might have expected to have his sayings passed down in that way, but not necessarily written down.
But it wasn't an oral culture like, say, the cultures of Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal society was, because they did have writing, they had scriptures, a certain proportion of them could read and write.
Yeah, about 5% of them, Ian. And most of those were the leaders, rulers, priests, and professionally employed scribes and merchants. So you're talking about a very specific class of people who were literate, and it was a tiny percentage.
Okay, let's move on to the next area, which may also be challenging to some of you, Bill, because it's a regular comparison thing.
Oh, look, this is where we like to get down with the text and really examine it. And there's nothing like a good comparison, particularly between the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, represented in this household by what people's theses were written on. So we have the Beatitudes here in Matthew and we have them in Luke. We don't know which come first definitively. Probably Matthew's is slightly earlier, but that's just my opinion.
I think Luke's was earlier.
No, you're wrong. Wrong.
Luke's
So-
using an older tradition, shorter tradition.
Yes, there is a theory that the more complex and the shorter the saying is, the more likely to be from the original words of Jesus or the original source, whatever that might be. So we've got some things here for you to have a look at. And it's Beatitudes in Matthew and Luke. Matthew's, of course, up on the Sermon on the Mount, and Luke is doing the Sermon on the Plain. And those contexts might be important for you to consider. So we've got a long question here for you. Oh, by the way, did you get the question I broadcast into your rooms?
Yes.
Yep.
You could see it? I'll do that again with this one because it is quite long, but it is in your notes. And also in your notes, you'll have both of them side by side and you can have a look at them. So we
Page
want to
6 of the
know
notes.
what you think. What similarities do you notice? What differences can you see? Luke has some curses. Does Matthew have some woes? Does Matthew have some of them, and where might they be if he does? So are you all clear about that? Okay, I'll give you lots of time to do this one because it's a bit tricky. There we go. And I'm opening your rooms now.
And I'll send
John,
you.
where's the question?
It's
Oh.
in your notes.
It's at the bottom of page 6.
Okay.
Well, welcome back, everybody. How did you get on with your comparisons between these Beatitudes?
We want to hear the Greek version.
You want to hear the Greek version? No, you don't. If I read it to you, it'd be all Greek to you, Enid.
Elizabeth, could you explain what blessed means in the original Greek or Aramaic? We got rather stuck on the notion of blessed. What does it really mean?
Right.
Does it mean you're lucky or fortunate, or does it have divine kingdom related implications? What's the meaning of the original word blessed?
Well, it's from the Hebrew Baruch. And it's a word that's a very interesting word in the Hebrew. Everything in Hebrew has 3 root consonants, every word, and the root consonants are the same for cursed as they are for blessed in Hebrew, but the vowels change. And that's how you know, maybe. If you're looking at a text that doesn't have vowels, which is you're looking at something that could be quite ambiguous. we tend to think of when we say I'm blessed that we've been given good health or lots of family or plenty of friends or a nice house or we live comfortably. That is not really what it means when you think about Hebrew. What it means is you have found honor in the sight of God. Sometimes it's translated as happy are those, but they're happy because God has noticed them. So it does have some kingdom implications in the sense that if you are one of these people, then you can assume you are part of the kingdom of heaven. And Matthew says that, and Luke, of course, says yours is the kingdom of God. Matthew, being a good Jew, doesn't use the name of God unduly, so he always refers to the kingdom of heaven in his gospel, where Luke and Mark refer to the kingdom of God. So it's a mixed thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have plenty of money and good health and lots of family. It just means you have found favour in the sight of God, in a sense.
And Elizabeth, does that mean that for some of those people hearing that would have been extremely good news? Because in the way things were, if you were sick, you know, like the man beside the pool, that means because there was sin somewhere involved. But here, that same man listening to this would say, but God still cares for me because, you know, I'm amongst the poor, I'm amongst the persecutor, or whatever you want to say. Does it have that overall implication for the hearers that no matter who they are part of God's kingdom?
Yes, it would. For those who might normally be on the fringes of society for whatever reason. But what are the differences that you might note directly between Matthew and Luke's Beatitudes? What's Luke doing that Matthew isn't as much? What has Matthew done to these Beatitudes?
I think he spiritualised them a little bit more than Luke. I mean, Luke seems very grounded and has got an emphasis in part of them on the poor, looking after the poor, implying that anyway, yours is the kingdom of God. Whereas Matthew in verse Matthew in verse 3 is saying, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, Kathy. Matthew is about more how you are living in terms of your faith, where Luke is more about who you are. So when Luke says, blessed are you who are hungry, the Greek word he uses there literally means famished, starving. So it's literal hunger, where Matthew has, blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness.
For righteousness.
So it's picking up how you live your faith. Do you hunger for thirst and righteousness? Are you humble in spirit? That is quite a marked difference in some ways between the two. And Luke says, blessed when people hate and revile you on account of my name. And Matthew says, blessed are you who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Righteousness is a theme that runs through Matthew. We'll meet it quite a few times, and he's making it clear here in his Beatitudes. So it's how you live out your faith. Are you merciful? Are you pure in heart? Do you make peace? Are you humble in spirit? Do you hunger for righteousness? Are you prepared to be persecuted for the sake of righteousness? This is the questions that Matthew's asking, where Luke's is a little simpler. I'm willing to concede to John on this point. Luke probably does have the more original version of the Beatitudes. I think Matthew has tarted up, if you like, his sources, and he is using and he's spelling out about how you live. And of course, that's about what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. How do you live if you're one of the faithful?
It's interesting, Elizabeth, but Luke comes quite a bit after Matthew in terms of it's when it was written.
Probably, but that doesn't mean they haven't got the same source and Luke's not tampered with it.
But you were saying how Matthew has developed the original a bit more, which is interesting if it's an earlier prescription.
I think Matthew has developed the original a little bit more, but I think Luke probably has something closer to the original sayings.
Okay.
I
So we
brought up that-
need to distinguish between the time when we think the gospel may have been written. We can only think that, we can't
Know that.
Right.
and the place in the development of the oral tradition that those sayings might have had. So maybe Luke, even though he's writing later, has a memory of an earlier, shorter, simpler version of the Beatitudes that Jesus spoke, whereas Matthew, even though he's writing earlier than Luke, he is working on the material and developing it.
Yeah.
What Luke got his, because it doesn't appear in Matthew, in Mark. So is he sourcing it in Q or some other?
This is one of the passages that's usually put down as Q passage. Yeah.
For those of you who don't know what Q is, it's considered that Matthew and Luke use two sources. One is the Gospel of Mark, which both of them repeat a huge percentage of. The second is an undiscovered theoretical source named Q, which is from the German Quell, which just means source. And Luke and Matthew have material that is very, very similar that is not found in Mark. And that is what we call Q. Any other comments?
Can I bring up another query? And that is, what is the significance? Do you think there is significance in the different populations that Matthew and Luke were writing to for? Matthew, a Jewish audience, and Luke, a Roman community, a non-Jewish, a Gentile Roman community.
Yeah.
We don't know if it's Roman.
Well,
probably safe to say
Roman
there's a lot
Empire.
of Gentiles.
Roman Empire, let's put it that way.
Yeah, Rome. Yes, probably Gentiles from the Roman Empire. In terms of Hellenistic people, there's probably some Jews in his community as well. Matthew is speaking to Jews, and next week we'll meet one of the first of Matthew's prohibitions about Gentiles. So it seems quite clear his community is Jewish. A lot of these sayings are drawn from the Psalms that he has in his Beatitudes. I think what we could deduce from this is that Matthew's community, whether they are or not, feel very persecuted and may well have been persecuted. And in chapter 10, it tells you that they're going to be flogged and dragged before rulers, etc., and punished for preaching the name of Jesus. So this seems to be something that Matthew has developed to frame his Sermon on the Mount about how living righteously has a reward beyond just getting monetary returns or living a nice life or any of those things. It's about faith. It's about inheriting the kingdom of heaven. It's about inheriting eternal life. So it's got quite a different emphasis. But Luke's gospel really does focus on the poor and the oppressed. And Jesus' statement in Luke 4 says he's come to give sight to the blind, to free the captives, to make those who are lame walk, etc., and bring good news to the poor. And that's exactly what his Beatitudes reflect. So in each of these group of Beatitudes, both writers are reflecting what their gospel is about. One is about righteous living, and one is about a more universal message to those who are on the edges of society.
Mm. Mm.
Any other comments or questions?
What about the woe part of the question?
Yes, the woe part. And
Anybody
I
talk
had
about-
worked out to broadcast. You should have got that halfway through or partway through. Where are Matthew's woes? Does he have any woes?
Yes.
He does? Where are they, Enid?
23.
And
Oh, Bill knows. Chapter
In the-
23.
yes, and in Bill in the NIV it lists as the woes of the teachers and Pharisees.
Well, yes, scribes and Pharisees. Matthew lays into them. This is really unique to the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 23. Matthew doesn't like Pharisees. Unlike Luke, he doesn't eat with them. He doesn't have Pharisees warn him. He doesn't have good and bad Pharisees. Every Pharisee in Matthew is a nasty piece of work and a hypocrite. according to this gospel. And I have to say at this point, this has done immeasurable damage to the Jewish people, because this is being used by anti-Semites in ways that really should not happen, because you've got to understand this chapter in its context and why Matthew wrote it. This is an intra-Jewish dispute. And as we know, that when you split in a church, or you split off from your parent faith, as Matthew has done here, or been thrown out of the synagogue, as in the Gospel of John, you're not very fond of the parent body that threw you out. And that is the context that these need to be understood in.
Mm.
There's also a nice literary construction going on here, because Matthew begins the first of the 5 blocks of Jesus with Beatitudes. Chapter 23 is the start of the 5th of the 5 teaching blocks of Jesus with these woes, which then goes on into the apocalyptic discourse and the parables of the judgment in the kingdom. So there's a nice, rather than Luke has the blessing and then the woe side by side, Matthew puts the blessings at the beginning, the woes at the end.
And Luke's woes echo, or they're oppositional to his blessings, where Matthew's woes are aimed at a specific group and what he sees as their poor behaviour.
Mm.
All right, last section.
We're looking at teachings on love in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, and they have a number of things that they both say about that in the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount. But as you can see, they're expressed somewhat differently. They've rearranged one of them has rearranged the order of whatever source that they had, and they've been slightly different contexts given. For instance, Luke says, if someone takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt, where Matthew says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. So they're clearly similar, but they're not the same. And the endings are slightly different. In Matthew, we have be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And in Luke, we have be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do you want to add anything to that, John?
No, it's just another comparison.
So we're going to get you to compare them, because we like to, you need to earn your keep and get really involved in the text. So we want you to compare the teachings in Matthew with those in Luke. What are the similarities and what are the differences? And how do you explain these differences? I'm sure you'll all do it very, very well. Okay, I'll just fix up breakout rooms. All right. Hello, welcome back. How did you all get on?
Well, can I just start with a bit of a question?
Sure.
They both mentioned this key verse to do with enemies, and
Yes.
that we are to love our enemies, even though they worded slightly differently. We didn't really go into that so much. But my question was, is that idea of loving enemies anywhere within the Old Testament? Is it in bits and pieces of the Psalms? I'm not sure, but it's certainly not a predominant thing at all.
No, it's not. It's not really in the Old Testament. This is one of the things that Jesus seems to have come up with to extend the idea of just loving your neighbours, which is certainly in the Old Testament and found in the Torah. But loving your enemies seems to be a step further that we're going here. And if we've got people being persecuted, that would make perfect sense. If you're being asked to pray for those that persecute you and to try and love them.
Well, the Israelites had plenty of enemies and people that were persecuting them and shoving them off to exile and everything, but I don't think they were necessarily asked to pray for them.
No, they weren't. And often and you get in the Psalms for instance, immediately after they were exiled and after the war and they were in Babylon, they're writing things like, may your children's heads be
Yeah,
dashed against
yeah.
rocks, you know, so.
Yeah.
Psalm 143, verse 12, in your steadfast love, O God, cut off my enemies and destroy all my adversaries, for I am your servant.
Mm.
Yes. So there's not much loving of enemies at all going on in the Old
No.
Testament.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
there
I'm
might,
mindful of those ones, but I don't feel
Yeah.
completely happy that if I should really scrutinise or ask a rabbi about it, that
Yeah.
there may not be something in about, actually, it might even be Deuteronomy.
I suspect
would-
in the rabbinic, in the
Yeah.
evolving rabbinic tradition,
Yeah.
Catherine,
Yeah.
that there would be that
Yeah.
development. Yeah.
Yeah. Margaret?
well, I was just thinking, but very vague thinking, that in Deuteronomy, in the law, there were things like, you know, treating the stranger properly because you were once aliens in
Yeah.
a foreign land, etc. You could extend that a little bit, I guess, but
Yeah.
Jesus has taken it even further
Hmm.
than that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
it seems to be that that's what he's done.
Isn't there a
Yeah.
verse somewhere that says that you leave it to God? Isn't there, in my memory somewhere, there's a verse that says, isn't it justice, leave justice to God?
Well, there is stuff about leaving justice to God, but that doesn't follow that means you have to love your enemies, Rosemary.
Oh, good.
We had an interesting discussion to which Marjorie made a valuable contribution. I started off by saying I don't find Vladimir Putin especially lovable. If I were Zelensky, the Ukrainian head of state, I would find it very difficult to love Putin or to forgive him. But Marjorie made a good point. It's not really for, if I'm interpreting you correctly, Marjorie, it's not for us to make that judgment. We hate the sin, but we respect the sinner.
Yes, that's a lovely Christian teaching that's completely unbiblical, but it's a nice thought, Anne.
But isn't that what God does with us? You know, the Shakespeare's condemn the deed, but not the doer. And
That's Shakespeare, Marjorie, not the New
yeah, I
Testament.
know, but God condemns our deeds, but never breaks the. You know, he still loves us. He hates our sins, but he never stops loving us, I think. I hope.
Well, I think that's true that God doesn't stop loving us, and there's all sorts of
Even
things God
though-
does to get people to behave. I've just pulled up a learned text on the Big Pathos site about whether or not it says love your enemy. There are a few things that you might want to. Proverbs 25 says if your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he's thirsty, give him water to drink. Exodus says if your enemy's ox or ass goes astray, you shall bring it back to him.
Yeah.
Job says, if I've rejoiced at the ruin that him that hated me or exalted when evil overtook him, this is bad behavior. Proverbs says, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles. So there are things in the Old Testament that could be seen as precursors to the idea that you would love your enemies.
And we need to bear in mind that Old Testament passages are telling stories that come from not just decades but centuries of time, and Israel is in a very different situation in different contexts. So the enemy of Israel, Babylon, when they captured them, that's what leads to the dash the children's heads against the rocks, that really vehement vitriol. And yet a so-called enemy of Israel, Cyrus, who of course is called the Anointed One, the Messiah in 2nd Isaiah, he lets them return. So their attitude to that enemy or that foreign power would be quite different. And so it's different psalms come from different contexts and different sages write in different, so it's quite varied.
And you will, I'm guessing you're right, John's right, in the Talmud and the Mishnah, there'll be writings of the rabbis. Now, your last question, how might you explain the differences between the two? Does anyone have any theories they'd like to advance?
Elizabeth, before we go there, we were wondering about the actual original word that in Matthew 48, where it says perfect.
Ah, yes, that's a very good question. Anyone have any theories about perfect?
No, that's why we're asking you.
Translation.
Right, because we're not Greek scholars.
It's an Old Testament concept that Matthew's using here. We think of perfect or a counsel of perfection is someone without fault or sin, but that is not quite how it would have been interpreted. It's more the sense of holiness. So it's more be holy as your heavenly Father is holy. So the law of the Lord is perfect. You can see up there in Psalm 18, reviving the soul. So the law of the Lord is holy. So if you follow that law, it brings a certain wholeness with it and holiness with it. So, and God, his way is perfect. It doesn't mean he's a counsel of perfection. What it means is God is holy.
And it's interesting that Matthew here is in one accord with Luke, because Luke has had Jesus say again and again about giving away your riches, sell your possessions, give your money to the poor. Matthew includes that saying in his account of Jesus' encounter with the rich man. That's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in Matthew, Jesus says to him, if you wish to be perfect, sell your possessions. So in other words, keeping the commandments is one thing, but Jesus has an intensified demand, and being perfect is to be fully and completely devoted to following the way that Jesus sets out. I think that's probably...
Yeah.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, it's from the Greek word teleos. So it means to be complete in all your parts, to be full grown, to be whole. So it's this sense of holiness, if you can achieve that.
So
sorry, Elizabeth or John. Separate. Ian questioned at the very beginning about the meaning of the word blessed or blessed.
Yes.
Please correct me. I don't know who did this Bible study at Synods back then. The word blessed in Aramaic is means straighten up. It's in Aramaic. And I always, and that definition of blessed as straighten up, it's very appropriate considering the context of Matthew and what I've heard about the context of Matthew, you know, a persecuted community. So to say to them, blessed, straighten up, you know, sit up, stand up. You are in
I think
God's
someone
favor.
was stretching the envelope with that Bible study, Otto.
Sorry?
I think they were stretching it.
Okay.
With that. I'm just looking at it now. I've just pulled it up, and it's Tuvayun is what it is, and it's really the same meaning that it has in the Hebrew. Well, they're very closely connected. You wouldn't expect it to have a completely different meaning. So where it can mean happy and it can mean fortunate, it can also mean you are blessed by God. That is, you are favoured by God as well. So it has those same sorts of meanings. I can't see anything in front of me here in the Aramaic dictionary that says straighten up. Sorry. I mean,
That's okay.
I haven't studied Aramaic, but yeah, I don't think that's quite right.
Thanks for that. That's okay. You can agree to disagree.
Well, I'm winning because
Need-
I've got the dictionary on my side, Otto, so I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's okay.
Well, we've hit our time, so we probably should draw to a close.
And next week,
yeah,
we're doing the riveting, fascinating and gripping mission in Matthew. Well, I find it fascinating, riveting and gripping anyway, and I hope you will too, because Matthew's take on mission is rather different to Mark and Luke's. And if you want to prepare yourself, I suggest you read chapter 10 in the Gospel of Matthew, and you will see what I'm talking about. And if you're really keen, you can then have a look at Luke's mission. He's got mission in pairs, and then Luke has the mission of the 70, and you can look at them as well. So thank you everyone for being with us this morning. I hope you got a lot of thought-provoking questions and insights that you'll now go away and ponder. Welcome again to everyone who's joined us for the first time. We hope you'll be back next week. And remember, if you're new, what we do at night is the same content as the morning. So you can swap them around if your life circumstances are such that needs to happen. And that's perfectly okay. So thank you all for being with us and your participation.